At this point, we are going to pivot, to choose a currently fashionable word, from the security scene to the economic position of the country. And to help us to do that, I'm pleased and honored to introduce an exceptional figure on the Washington and the national scene. He was the vice chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel on the Troubled Asset Relief Program, playing a critical role in attempting to make the basic instrument of economic stabilization at the depths of the great crisis work. He is the General Counsel and Director of Public Policy for the AFL CIO, and is known to all of us who have worked with him as an extraordinarily adept and incisive player, and especially thinker, in terms of the strategy that we should be pursuing going forward. Let me therefore introduce my friend Damon Silvers.
All right. Well, good morning. It's really a great pleasure to be with all of you, and an honor to have been asked to give the keynote today. It's particularly a great pleasure for me because I have the chance to do a favor for my friend, and I think all of our friend, Jamie Galbraith. Jamie's leadership over the last few years in the world, what is truly a worldwide fight against the insanity of austerity, is, I think, to some degree underappreciated. And so this is a chance for me to express my personal appreciation, but also the appreciation of the American labor movement. President Rich Trump asked me to say a word on his behalf to you, and our brothers and sisters all around the world. We are really in Jamie's debt. Now, when I asked Jamie what he wanted me to talk about, he said, in light of the election we just had, explain what comes next. Now, I've said for years, one of the first things that happened to me when I showed up in Washington at the age of like 33 or something like that, that I got a phone call from reporters saying, tell me what's going to happen on the Hill next week. And I was like, only a fool would do that. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to answer Jamie's question. And in doing so, I'm going to try to come ultimately around to some larger issues that actually come back to the international affairs focus of this organization and of this meeting. But first, to understand what comes next, we really have to understand first what just happened. And let me begin with a single fact about the election 2 weeks ago, which is on the screen over here in case you missed it. The AFL-CIO did an exit poll of voters, not union members, but all voters, in 11 swing states. And now remember, the election we just had, which had the lowest turnout of any election since World War II, skewed older, white, and more affluent in general. And the 11 swing states skewed even more older and whiter than the country as a whole in the election. So sort of a double skewing. Now, we asked this electorate, has your family's income risen, stayed the same, or fallen in the last year? Now, the time frame is really important here. We're not asking about what's happened to you since the economic crisis began. We're asking what's happened to you in the last year, the 5th year of the technical recovery. And the answer was that a whole 8% said that their income had risen. 33% said that they were treading water, and 54% said their family's income had fallen. Now, our view is that you really don't need to ask any more questions about this election. That's the whole story. People went to the polls. This was their experience. They perceived, remember, most Americans know who the president is. They know who their mayor and their governor is. And after that, it becomes really murky. So, Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner and Mitch McConnell and all these people loom very large in the minds of politicos. you get very far, you get very far away from where we sit right now, meaning like more than about a mile, and like nobody knows who they are. So in the election, people went to polls in a country they perceived to be run by Democrats. This was their experience, and they voted accordingly. But here's the puzzling part. We also asked this same group of people. Remember the skewing involved. We asked this same group of people what policies did they want to see adopted. By large margins, the voters that we polled favored investing in education and our infrastructure, increasing Social Security benefits, closing Social Security's deficit by removing the cap on Social Security taxes, raising the minimum wage, ending tax breaks for companies that outsource jobs, and passing comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship. And finally, this is not on the slide, but a majority felt that the Republicans, which they had voted for, had no plan for improving the economy. Not that they disagreed with their plan, they simply didn't believe they had one. Now, the amazing thing about the poll that we did of people's perceptions of their incomes is that it tracks big data. It's yet another example that the American people aren't actually so stupid. They have a pretty keen understanding of how things are unfolding around them, particularly when it's unfolding to them. So the poll response to the people's income levels tracks pretty precisely the Thomas Piketty data on what's happened to income growth over the last generation. Now, and it shows really how the political economy of the United States has fundamentally, structurally changed since many of us were young. Now, I know that actually the ages of folks may vary a little bit more than this, but in most rooms I talked to, pretty much everybody was born between 1935 and 1980. Okay? Now, if you were born between 1935 and 1980, you were born into an economy whose labor market looked like this. Oops, nope, so this was I missed this slide. Come back to this point. So I'm going to skip around. All right. This is the slide that I wanted to start with. You were born into an economy that looked like this. Between 1935 and 1980, average incomes in the United States grew quite dramatically. And the distribution of income growth, the contributions to income growth, were divided like this between the bottom 90%, 90, and the top 10%. The bottom 90% didn't get their full share maybe, but they got a big piece of it. 70% of income growth was the contribution from the bottom 90%. The top 10% provided a disproportionate contribution, but not even the majority. This is post-war America. Now, the economy we live in now, which began to come into place in the 1970s and early 1980s, but which really locked in the 1990s, looks very different. In fact, it looks so different we can't really graphically depict it. The reason why is because although incomes on average rose in the United States between 1997 and 2012, which is the most recent data we have, all of the income gains went to the top 90%. Not some, not a majority, not the predominant amount, all of it. In fact, the average income figure disguises the fact that for the bottom 90%, from 1997 to 2012, a 15-year period, incomes fell. Now, what explains the fact that this electorate, with this experience and these policy preferences, just elected Senate candidates that are pledged to, in almost every case, do the opposite of what the electorate said they wanted? The answer is, we think, explained by this slide. Same poll. 62% of the voters in the swing states said that corporations had too much influence on both parties. and 82% said politicians of both parties do too much to help Wall Street and too little to help average Americans. Now, you would think that this opinion would lead to a kind of to hell with all of them approach to voting. But that's not what it does at all. Because remember, what does the Democratic Party exist to do? Or at least what has its historic brand been? Back, frankly, from today back to the time of Thomas Jefferson. It is supposed to be the party, at its fundamental core, that stands up for the ordinary person against the power of economic privilege. And if it's not doing that, why vote for it? And honestly, after 8 years where Democrats controlled either the Senate or the House, or both, and 6 years into the presidency of Barack Obama, where do we stand? Compared to Inauguration Day on 2009, the wealth of the 1% has largely recovered. The 99% are poorer, and if you're African American or Latino, you are a lot poorer on average. Real wages, as I just explained, for most Americans are down. When you combine foreclosures and forced sales of various kinds, something like 10 million American families, 40 million people, have lost their homes. And the CEOs of Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase are wealthier and more powerful than ever.
And not in jail.
Yes, and free. Free. Now, I say this not to take away from the real achievements of the Obama administration. President Obama's stimulus undoubtedly saved us from a depression. And had the policy ideas of the Republicans been adopted instead, we would look like Spain or Greece today. Similarly, the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank Act, flawed as they both are nonetheless dramatic improvements over the way things were before they were passed. And if, as the President has, I gather, made quite clear this week, he moves to essentially protect 5 million long-term residents in the United States from being thrown out of the country, leaving their children behind, he will have done something significant. But against the stark data I just cited you, these achievements simply did not cut it with the voters 2 weeks ago. And what passed for the Democratic Party's economic program in 2014, the 10-10 minimum wage they could not get through the Senate, a bit more money for job training, this sort of fragmentary agenda did not appear to voters to make a difference in what they see, for good reason, to be a fundamentally unfair economy. The Democratic agenda in 2014 offered neither the credible promise of renovating our nation's economy, nor was it able to inspire our nation's electorate. Now, that is not to say that all Democrats lack an economic plan or an economic message. In races where Senate Democrats embraced a populist economic agenda, like the one our poll laid out, and took the fight to Republicans, candidates like Jeff Merkley and Al Franken, who were thought to be facing tough elections, won easily. But the truth is that the Democratic Party in the age of Obama has been profoundly wounded by the economic and political consequences of the combination of the bank bailouts and austerity. Politically, the bank bailouts fundamentally undercut the identity of the Democratic Party as the party of working people. And economically, the choice to bail out bankers rather than homeowners, followed by the, quote, pivot to fiscal consolidation in late 2009, created the economy we now live in, which is characterized by slow growth, stagnant or falling wages, and what life in it is dependent on continued support from the Federal Reserve. So the voters have punished the Democrats for these choices, not once, but twice, in 2010 and in 2014. And they would have done so in 2012, but for the Republicans' somewhat bizarre decision to nominate a banker as their standard bearer. I suppose, as I recall, the other options were worse, but it still was a losing decision. And in a larger sense, the decline in wages that was the key background fact in this election was the clearly foreseeable consequence of a generation of neoliberal policies pursued by both parties, regardless of where we stood in economic cycles. But the Democrats, as I said earlier, are the losers when the parties become economically equivalent. So now we face the prospect of a lame duck session, followed by a new Congress in which Republicans have declared they wish to get things done. Now, there is an agenda that progressives and a significant number of Republicans have in common, and that includes some major items: infrastructure investment, moving against currency manipulation by our trading partners, and comprehensive immigration reform come immediately to mind. It's not that well known, it should be better known, but the AFL-CIO and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have a documented understanding on both infrastructure and immigration reform. And then there is, in many ways, the most interesting item, which we don't have an agreement with the Chamber of Commerce on, because it is so implausible that this is actually alive. There are significant policy voices in the Republican Party, a different part of the party than the Chamber, that really want to take on too big to fail banks, either by limiting their size directly, by reinstating Glass-Steagall, or by pressing the banks to make their living wills under Dodd-Frank really usable. At a recent symposium organized by MIT's Simon Johnson, you could hear this sort of view expressed by several influential Republican financial regulators, with a lot of Republican Hill staffers in the audience taking notes. Now, I want to say loud and clear that each of these goals is very important to the labor movement, and we are eager to work with anyone, Republicans or Democrats, to get them done. But I'm not going to hold my breath, because the conflicts in the Republican Party, and even within the business wing of the Republican Party, are fearsome. Some that have gotten a lot of attention are between those who believe in essentially an agenda of government enhancing U.S. competitiveness, and those who believe that government should, if possible, disappear. Call it the clash of Alexander Hamilton with Ayn Rand. But even in the business wing of the Republican Party, there are paralyzing conflicts on key issues. Consider corporate tax reform. The labor movement is quite interested in corporate tax reform and intends to hold some people's feet to the fire around some basic principles. But if we vanish tomorrow, they still couldn't get it done. The reason why is because Republicans have to consider, given who pays the bills around there, Republicans have to consider the demands of companies like Apple and GE that have essentially stopped paying taxes, that the Republicans preserve their offshore tax dodgers. And at the same time, the Republicans must consider the demands of less devious firms that are actually paying taxes who want to have their rates lowered. The only way to do both is to gut the corporate tax system as a whole, which would affect revenues in a big way and would have to be paid for, unless, under the current congressional rules around these things, unless, of course, the Republicans choose to change the rules on the theory that balancing budgets is the kind of fairy tale that Republicans tell Democrats but do not tell each other. Now, and these questions don't even get to the more fundamental issues that the Republicans are going to have to fight about, which involve essentially how much time are they going to spend doing things like attacking the Affordable Care Act, seeking to undo President Obama's upcoming executive order protecting families from being broken up by deportations, and holding hearings attacking climate scientists. Every moment spent on these issues dear to their funders represents time taken away from actually doing anything, good or bad. So the labor movement is preparing to deal with whatever face the Republicans choose to show us. We have definitely not given up on working with them to achieve some goals we think we share with them. But in significant respects, our concerns really lie elsewhere, with Democrats. Why is this? First, because the way our government works, Democrats hold a veto on almost everything, literally and figuratively, that's going to come up in American public life in the next 2 years. But only if they choose to use it. The circumstances in which they use that veto will establish the real balance of power in Washington over the next 2 years. And the ball is really in the court of the White House and the Democratic leadership in both houses, and particularly in the Senate. But our focus is on Democrats for a deeper reason. The next 2 years are very unlikely to produce real steps toward addressing our nation's most fundamental problems at the federal level, starting with wage stagnation, unless, of course, we make it worse, say by entering into a trade agreement designed to put further downward pressure on wages. The real question, both from a substantive and a political level, is what will the Democratic agenda be in 2016 and the years to follow? As many of you know, 2016 is not only a presidential year, with the likelihood of a far higher turnout than the record low of 2014, it is a year where the Senate playing field is dramatically tilted in favor of Democrats. But as 2008 taught us, It is simply not good enough to elect people who promise to be progressives. Our country needs an economic program that is not hobbled by the demands of Wall Street, that is bold and visionary, that aims at an economy strong enough, inclusive enough, to support a reinvigorated democracy, a democracy that can make the investments we need to stop climate change, a vision, and that can realize a vision for a competitive America and a sustainable world. Now, this is the kind of program that the voters supported in our exit poll, a transformative increase in the minimum wage, investments in our country, in our schools, our roads and bridges and ports and airports, on a scale to not just catch up, but to surpass our global competitors, and to tackle climate change, and to change the access of the entire American people to the digital age. Access to education in universities and community colleges and in the workplace without debt peonage, and a right to bargain with your employer without fear. Now, the Democratic Party's base must hold elected officials and prospective elected officials accountable to this plan, not just in what they say, but in who they hire and who they listen to. We will simply no longer accept the answer that President Obama once gave when he was asked about why he staffed his administration from Wall Street. He said there was nothing to worry about. He was the president, and he made the decisions. We have not forgotten that while the president makes the decisions, he does so from a menu of choices laid out by the staff. It's like saying that the customers in a restaurant decide what they're going to eat. That is true in a limited sense, but you won't get Chinese food in a French restaurant. And we refuse to eat in Bob Rubin's restaurant ever again. To move forward, we need to have a big economic agenda that directly addresses how we are going to prosper in the 21st century, which starts with ending wage stagnation. In fact, it's better described as wage decline. For that agenda to succeed at any level, in local minimum wage fights, in the battle for the Democratic Party's soul, or in the presidential election in 2016, we need to get two things clear. First, falling wages and rising productivity is the definition of injustice. But we will not win if we simply speak to those who are motivated by issues of justice and injustice. The truth is, and I could show you polls that document this, unfortunately in grim detail. The truth is, too many Americans whose wages are falling think that we have literally no choice, that any other path will cost us jobs and growth. Too many of us have come to accept economic serfdom as the best we can do. Now, in part, and by the way, I'm not talking about elites. Persuading elites of this is kind of irrelevant. I'm talking about the people who are actually suffering. In part, organizing and winning fights, like the $15 an hour minimum wage in Seattle, is itself the best cure for this type of despair. And nothing would be more transformative of our economy and our society right now than a big organizing victory for low-wage workers at employers like McDonald's and Walmart. But even these basic facts require message discipline around a simple true statement. Economic inclusion and real wage growth is the key to prosperity. Now, I believe that's true for three reasons. The first is, I think, well known to everyone in the room, which is that the relationship between broad wage growth and aggregate demand, and the need to have broad wage growth to spur a virtuous cycle of business investment, innovation, and productivity. But there are other reasons. The second is increasingly salient in our society as we await the verdict in Ferguson. Not the verdict, but the question what the grand jury is going to do in Ferguson, which is when a country excludes people from fully participating in its economy because of racism or sexism or homophobia, or because we treat immigrants like they were less than fully human, then we essentially deny our country the fruits of our people's creativity, their capacity to fully contribute. And third, a radically unequal society is unlikely to be able to summon the social solidarity, the social glue to make the public investments we must make to prosper in our infrastructure, our educational system, and in basic research that underlies innovation. These things require taxes. And today, in a society, and here, I'll show you something. Today, in a society where the Koch brothers and the Walton family, now these are the Koch brothers and the Walton family. There are 2 Koch brothers, and there are 6 Walton children. That's them. All right? The Koch brothers and the Walton family are worth $230 billion. Okay? Where they are worth more than 45% of the American people. Okay? In that circumstance, those 8 little dudes' desire not to pay more taxes effectively outvotes the majority's desires for schools and roads and bridges and universal broadband and affordable higher education and doing something about climate change, and on and on and on. So if this is why we have to have some level of economic justice to prosper, there is another message point that must be central to our strategy, because it's equally true. Falling wages, as I showed you at the beginning of this talk, is a majoritarian problem. Men's wages and women's wages are falling. The wages of whites, African Americans, Latinos, and Asians are falling. This is happening to 90% of America's families. Both to deal with the real problem and to win the fight, we need a majoritarian approach to raising wages. That means that while raising the minimum wage is an important part of what must be done, it is simply not sufficient. Raising the minimum wage must be paired with policy measures designed to raise wages broadly across the labor market, starting with an insistence that the Federal Reserve measure the health of the labor market by whether real wages are rising with productivity. And I can report that based on her public statements, it seems to me that Janet Yellen is very much open to this point of view. It's one of the very few bright spots in public policy today, and a very important bright spot. Now, these points are connected to some deeper issues. Because if this election at one level was about falling wages and the capture of our political system by Wall Street, at another level, it was about something more profound that was touched on in the last panel. 3 huge structural facts about American society are about to change, and really, in a sense, are already changing. We will soon be, if we are not already, surpassed by China as the world's largest economy. And the gap is going to grow. Currently, we are by the way the OECD counts these things, we are roughly 22% of the world's GDP, while China is 17%. The OECD predicts that by 2030, we will be only 18%, and China will be 27%. To give you a sense of the magnitude of this change, no one is alive who can remember when the United States was not the world's largest economy. Secondly, we are going to be a nation whose majority will not be white, a majority-minority country. Already this is true of children being born in America, and it is true of our largest state by population, California. Get ready for a society where the artificial identity of white itself diminishes in meaning. I am convinced that my grandchildren may not understand what the term racial minority means. Third, the role of carbon-based fuels in our economy is going to change. In fact, it is changing already. And our nation's focus on carbon-based fuels, which for so long has been a source of competitive advantage, is going to be a drag on our competitiveness. By the way, if that doesn't happen, and not just here but all over the world, our nation's ability to feed itself is going to be under pressure from climate change, and our nation's major coastal regions will come under increasing pressure from rising seas as the century progresses. But the data we have now, and it's particularly striking in the last few months, the data we have now is quite persuasive that that the change away from carbon fuels on a global basis is underway. This doesn't mean that carbon-based fuels are going to disappear. Natural gas, oil, and coal will be important parts of our economy for some time to come. Critical applications like jet fuel and metallurgical coal have no substitutes, and the natural gas boom is going to be a significant driver of job creation for years to come in the United States. But the relative importance is shifting among these fuels and shifting rapidly. And again, these changes have altered aspects of our economy that have been fixtures in American life for more than 100 years. Now, in a sense, while this is not true of all Republicans, the mainstream Republican program can be summarized as the equivalent of standing in the doorway of history and trying to block this future from coming in. But as is often said in Washington, it's all over but the shouting. This future is coming. Except that's not really true. While this future is coming, America's strategic response will determine what this future means for America. And it is not simply a matter of domestic policy. Our foreign and military policy will be completely shaped by our nation's strategic responses to these realities. In this context, the extent of our involvement in the Middle East seems in some respects a relic of the economic and energy posture of the 1970s and 1980s. On the other hand, our sustained inability to think clearly about our relationship with China and our insistence on subcontracting that relationship to business interests in the U.S. that have a clear desire to keep wages low in both countries seems to me a form of madness. The truth is that the 21st century should be a time of unparalleled prosperity to the United States, not in spite of the trends I outlined, but because of them. These trends offer the prospect of escaping from the worst aspects of our history, our racism, our imperial past, and the growth of foreign markets should propel our economy, if only our economy were broadly competitive. If only we harness the true potential of our workforce and leverage the strength of our domestic market properly instead of trying to destroy it. America stands on the brink of a new age of prosperity, where scientific and engineering advances in computing, biotech, and energy can transform our lives for the better in ways as dramatic as the automobile, the washing machine, and penicillin transformed the lives of our great-grandparents. And in the 21st century, America need not prosper at the larger world's expense. In fact, our path to a prosperous future is truly dependent in ways we have never been before on the prosperity of the larger world around us. If you doubt that, just look at what austerity has done to us. But a prosperous 21st century will not happen by itself. Formidable obstacles lie between us and the future we seek. But these obstacles are not iron laws of economics, limits on natural resources, or demographics as destiny. These obstacles, as has been true time and again in our past, are fundamentally political. We live in a country where our politics has been entwined with destructive social and economic thinking centered on the false idea that we are isolated individuals. That, as Margaret Thatcher once said, there was no such thing as society, there was only individuals. Behind this utterly false conception of what it means to be human lies vast organized economic and political power, these folks, focused on maintaining and intensifying economic inequality. The result is the paradox of America possessing the greatest accumulation of wealth in human history, but with a population whose incomes are falling and where tens of millions of us live lives little better than those of the poorest people on earth. And worst of all, the legacy of a political economy of selfish individualism is a nation that today lacks confidence both in our democracy and in our future, when we should be moving boldly to build the better world that our democratic legacy and our scientific and technical ingenuity uniquely prepare our country to create. This set of political problems, and I'm going to come back to where I started, this set of political problems stands directly in the way of our country taking the most basic steps we need to take to prosper in the 21st century. Consider energy. We refuse to do anything to help the millions of people whose jobs are disappearing and whose communities are decomposing due to the decline in the Appalachian coal economy. Then, environmentalists in the Democratic Party are surprised that Mitch McConnell is reelected to the Senate from Kentucky. Of course, McConnell has no plan to deal with the fact that natural gas is underpriced coal. He simply intends to profit politically from the suffering of his own state for as long as he possibly can. But I, for one, am not at all surprised that if the politics of coal are defined by Mitch McConnell on the one hand, and Mike Bloomberg, a New York billionaire who wants to shut the coal industry down and have miners bear the costs on the other hand, that the people of Kentucky choose McConnell. We need as a country a different set of choices other than the conflict between frankly authoritarian elites and simply elitist elites. We need a truly democratic, with a small d, set of policy options tied to a rebirth of the idea of solidarity in our public life. We need to listen a bit to Pope Francis on this subject, who has managed to reawaken these very concepts in the Catholic Church. We need to do this not just because if we don't, our future will be bleak. We need to do it because if we do, if we renovate our national home, politically, economically, and technologically, the future that so many of us look to with cynicism and even outright despair can be better, far better than our past. And that is something worth fighting for. Thank you.